Chapter 15. Matters to Arise. The next few months saw a number of changes in Midwich. Dr. Willers handed over his practice to the care of a locum, the young man who had helped him during the crisis, and, accompanied by Mrs. Willers, went off in a state of mingled exhaustion and disgust with authority, on a holiday that was said to be taking him round the world. In November we had an epidemic of influenza, which carried off 3 elderly villagers, and also 3 of the children. One of them was Ferrelin's boy. She was sent for and came hurrying home at once, but arrived too late to see him alive. The others were 2 of the girls. Well before that, however, there had been the sensational evacuation of the Grange, a fine bit of service organisation. The researchers first heard about it on the Monday, the vans arrived on Wednesday, and by the weekend the house and the expensive new laboratories stood blank-windowed and empty, leaving the villagers with the feeling that they had seen a piece of pantomime magic. For Mr. Crimm and his staff had gone too, and all that was left were 4 of the golden-eyed babies for whom foster parents had to be found. A week later, a desiccated-looking couple called Freeman moved into the cottage vacated by Mr. Crimm. Freeman introduced himself as a medical man specializing in social psychology, and his wife, too, it appeared, was a doctor of medicine. We were led to understand, in a cautious way, that their purpose was to study the development of the children on behalf of an unspecified official body. This, after their own fashion, they presumably did, for they were continually lurking and peering about the village, often insinuating themselves into the cottages, and not infrequently to be found on one of the seats on the green, pondering weightily and watchfully. They had an aggressive discretion which verged upon the conspiratorial, and tactics which, within a week of their arrival, caused them to be generally resented and referred to as the nosies. Doggedness, however, was another of their characteristics, and they persisted in the face of discouragement until they gained the kind of acceptance accorded to the inevitable. I checked on them with Bernard. He said they were nothing to do with his department, but their appointment was authentic. We felt that if they were to be the only outcome of Willer's anxiety for study of the children, it was as well that he was away. Zellaby offered, as indeed did all of us, a few cooperative overtures to them, but made no headway. Whatever department was employing them had picked winners for discretion, but we felt that, importantly as discretion might be regarded in the larger sphere, a little more sociability within the community could have brought them fuller information with less effort. Still, there it was. They might, for all we knew, be turning in useful reports somewhere. All we could do was let them prowl in their chosen fashion. However interesting, scientifically, the children may have been during the first year of their lives, there was little about them during that time to cause further misgiving. Apart from their continued resistance to any attempt to remove them from Midwich, the reminders of their compulsive powers were most mild and infrequent. They were, as Zellaby had said, remarkably sensible and self-sufficient babies, as long as nobody neglected them or crossed their wishes. There was very little about them at this stage to support the ominous ruminations of the beldame group, or, for that matter, the differently cast, but scarcely less gloomy, prognostications of Zellaby himself, and as the time passed with unexpected placidity, Janet and I were not the only ones who began to wonder whether we had not all been misled, and if the unusual qualities in the children were not fading, perhaps to dwindle into insignificance as they should grow older. And then, early in the following summer, Zellaby made a discovery which appeared to have escaped the Freemans, for all their conscientious watching. He turned up at our cottage one sunny afternoon and ruthlessly routed us out. I protested at having my work interrupted, but he was not to be put off. "I know, my dear fellow, I know. I have a picture of my own publisher with tears in his eyes, but this is important. I need reliable witnesses." "Of what?" inquired Janet, with little enthusiasm. But Zellaby shook his head. "I'm making no leading statements, incubating no germs. I am simply asking you to watch an experiment and draw your own conclusions. Now, here," he fumbled in his pockets, "is our apparatus." He laid on the table a small ornamental wooden box, about half as big again as a matchbox, and one of those puzzles consisting of 2 large nails, so bent that they are linked together but will, when held in the right positions, slide easily apart. He picked up the wooden box and shook it. Something rattled inside. "Barley sugar," he explained.
This is one of the products of feckless Nipponese ingenuity. It has no visible means of opening, but slide aside this bit of the marquetry here, and it opens without difficulty, and here's your barley sugar. Why anybody should trouble himself to construct such a thing is known only to the Japanese, but for us it will, I think, turn out to have a useful purpose after all. Now, which of the children, male, shall we try it on first?
None of these babies is quite a year old yet, Janet pointed out, a little chillingly.
In every respect, except that of actual duration, they are, as you very well know, quite well-developed 2-year-olds, Zellaby countered. And in any case, what I am proposing is not exactly an intelligence test. Or is it?
He broke off uncertainly.
I must admit that I'm not sure about that. However, it doesn't greatly matter. Just name the child.
All right, Mrs. Brant's, said Janet. So to Mrs. Brant's we went. Mrs. Brant showed us through into her small back garden, where the child was in a playpen on the lawn. He looked, as Zellaby had pointed out, every bit of 2 years old, and brightly intelligent at that. Zellaby gave him the little box. The boy took it, looked at it, found that it rattled, and shook it delightedly. We watched him decide that it must be a box, and try unsuccessfully to open it. Zellaby let him go on playing with it for a bit, and then produced a piece of barley sugar, and traded it for the return of his box, still unopened. "I don't see what that's supposed to show," Janet said as we left.
"Patience, my dear," Zellaby said reprovingly. "Which shall we try next? Male again?"
Janet suggested the vicarage as convenient. Zellaby shook his head.
"No, that won't do. Polly Rushton's baby girl would very likely be on hand, too."
"Does that matter? It all seems very mysterious," said Janet.
"I want my witnesses satisfied," said Zellaby. "Try another."
We settled for the elder Mrs. Dorries. There he went through the same performance, but after playing with the box a little, the child offered it back to him, looking up expectantly. Zellaby, however, did not take it from him. Instead, he showed the child how to open the box, and then let him do it for himself and take out the sweet. Zellaby thereupon put another piece of barley sugar in the box, closed it, and presently handed it to him again.
"Try once more," he suggested,
and we watched the little boy open it easily and achieve a second sweet.
"Now," said Zellaby as we left, "we go back to Exhibit 1, the Brant child."
In Mrs. Brant's garden again, he presented the child in the playpen with the box just as he had before. The child took it eagerly. Without the least hesitation, he found and slid back the movable bit of marquetry and extracted the sweet, as if he had done it a dozen times before. Zellaby looked at our dumbfounded expressions with an amused twinkle. Once more he retrieved and reloaded the box.
"Well," he said, "name another boy."
We visited 3 up and down the village. None of them showed the least puzzlement over the box. They opened it as if it were perfectly familiar to them, and made sure of the contents without delay.
"Interesting, isn't it?" remarked Zellaby. "Now let's start on the girls."
We went through the same procedure again, except that this time it was to the 3rd instead of to the 2nd child that he showed the secret of opening the box. After that, matters went just as before.
"Fascinating, don't you think?" beamed Zellaby. "Like to try them with a nail puzzle?"
"Later, perhaps," Janet told him. "Just at present I should like some tea." So we took him back with us to the cottage.
"That box idea was a good one," Zellaby congratulated himself modestly, while wolfing a cucumber sandwich. "Simple, incontestable, and went off without a hitch, too."
"Does that mean you've been trying other ideas on them?" Janet inquired.
"Oh, quite a number. Some of them were a bit too complicated, though, and others not fully conclusive. Besides, I hadn't got hold of the right end of the stick to begin with."
"Are you quite sure you have now? Because I'm not at all sure that I have," Janet told him. He looked at her.
"Well, I rather think you must have. And that Richard has, too. You don't need to be shy of admitting it."
He helped himself to another sandwich and looked inquiringly at me. "I suppose," I told him, "that you're wanting me to say that your experiment has shown that what one of the boys knows, all the boys know, though the girls do not, and vice versa." "All right, then, that is what it appears to show. Unless there's a catch somewhere,"
My dear fellow, well, you must admit that what it appears to show is a little more than anyone is likely to be able to swallow in one gulp. Oh, I see. Yes, of course. I myself arrived at it by stages. He nodded. But, I said, it is what we were intended to infer. Of course, my dear fellow. Could it be clearer? He took the linked nails from his pocket and dropped them on the table. Take these and try for yourselves. Or, better still, devise your own little test and apply it. You'll find the inference, at least the preliminary inference, inescapable. To appreciate takes longer than to grasp, I said. But let's regard it as a hypothesis which I accept for the moment. Wait a minute, put in Janet. Mr. Zellaby, are you claiming that if I were to tell anything to any one of the boys, all the rest would know it? Certainly. Provided, of course, that it was something simple enough for them to understand at this stage. Janet looked highly sceptical. Zellaby sighed. The old trouble, he said. Lynch Darwin, and you show the impossibility of evolution. But, as I said, you've only to apply your own tests. He turned back to me. You were allowing the hypothesis, he suggested. Yes, I agreed. And you said that was the preliminary inference. What is the next one? I should have thought that just that one contained implications enough to capsize our social system. Couldn't this be something like... a more developed form of the sort of sympathetic understanding that's sometimes found between twins? Janet asked. Zellaby shook his head. I think not. Or else it has developed far enough to have acquired new features. Besides, we don't have here one single group en rapport. We have two separate groups of rapport, apparently without cross-connections. Now, if that is so, and we have seen that it is, a question that immediately presents itself is this. To what extent is any of these children an individual? Each is physically an individual, as we can see, but is he so in other ways? If he is sharing consciousness with the rest of the group instead of having to communicate with others with difficulty, as we do, can he be said to have a mind of his own, a separate personality, as we understand it? I don't see that he can. It seems perfectly clear that if A, B, and C share a common consciousness, then what A expresses is also what B and C are thinking, and that way action taken by B in particular circumstances is exactly that which would be taken by A and C in those circumstances, subject only to modifications arising from physical differences between them, which may, in fact, be considerable insofar as conduct is very susceptible to conditions of the glands and other factors in the physical individual. In other words, if I ask a question to any of these boys, I shall get exactly the same answer from whichever I choose to ask. If I ask him to perform an action, I shall get more or less the same result, but it is likely to be more successful with some who happen to have better physical coordination than others, though, in point of fact, with such close similarity as there is among the children, the variation will be small. But my point is this. It will not be an individual who answers me or performs what I ask. It will be an item of the group, and in that alone lie plenty of further questions and implications. Janet was frowning. I still don't quite... Well, let me put it differently, said Zellaby. What we have seemed to have here is 58 little individual entities. But appearances have been deceptive, and we find that what we actually have are two entities only, a boy and a girl. Though the boy has 30 component parts, each with the physical structure and appearance of individual boys, and the girl has 28 component parts. There was a pause. Presently, I find that rather hard to take, said Janet, with careful understatement. Well, yes, of course, agreed Zellaby. So did I. Look here, I said, after a further pause. You're putting this forward as a serious proposition. I mean, it isn't just a dramatic manner of speaking. I am stating a fact, having shown you the evidence first. I shook my head. All you showed us was that they are able to communicate in some way that I don't understand. To proceed from that to your theory of non-individualism is too much of a jump. On that piece of evidence alone, perhaps so, but you must remember that though this is the first you have seen, I have already conducted a number of tests, and not one of them has contradicted the idea of what I prefer to call collective individualism. Moreover, it is not as strange, per se, as it appears at first sight. It is quite a well-established evolutionary dodge for getting round a shortcoming. A number of forms that appear at first to be individuals turn out to be colonies, and many forms cannot survive at all unless they create colonies which operate as individuals. Admittedly, the best examples are among the lower forms, but there's no reason why it should be confined to them. Many of the insects come pretty near it. The laws of physics prevent them increasing in size, so they contrive greater efficiency by acting as a group. We ourselves combine in groups consciously, instead of by instinct, for the same purposes. Very well. Why shouldn't nature produce a more efficient version of the method by which we clumsily contrive to overcome our own weakness? Another case of nature copying art, perhaps. After all, we are up against the barriers to further development, and we have been for some time. Unless we are to stagnate, we must find some way of getting round them. GBS proposed, you will remember, that the first step should be to extend the term of human life to 300 years. That might be one way, and no doubt the extension of individual life would have a strong appeal to so determined an individualist. But there are others, and though this is not perhaps a line of evolution one would expect to find among the higher animals, it is obviously not impracticable. Though, of course, that is by no means to say that it is bound to be successful.
A quick glance at Janet's expression showed me that she had dropped out. When she has decided that someone is talking nonsense, she makes a quick decision to waste no more effort upon it, and pulls down an impervious mental curtain. I went on, pondering, looking out of the window. I think, I said presently, rather like a chameleon placed on a colour it can't quite manage. If I have followed you, you are saying that in each of these two groups the minds are in some way, well, pooled. Would that imply that the boys have, collectively, a normal brain power multiplied by 30, and the girls have it multiplied by 28?
I think not,
said Zellaby, quite seriously.
And it certainly does not mean normal abilities to the power of 30. Thank heaven. That would be beyond any comprehension. It does appear to mean multiplication of intelligence in some degree, but at their present stage I don't see how that can be estimated, if it ever could be. That may portend tremendous things. But what seems to me of more immediate importance is the degree of willpower that has been produced. The potentialities of that strike me as very serious indeed. One has no idea how these compulsions are exerted, but I fancy that if it can be explored, we might find that when a certain degree of will is, so as to speak, concentrated in one vessel, a Hegelian change takes place. That is, that in more than a critical quantity it begins to display a new quality. In this case, a power of direct imposition. That, however, I frankly admit, is speculative, and I can now foresee a devil of a lot to speculate about and investigate.
The whole thing sounds incredibly complicated to me, if you're right.
In detail, in the mechanics, yes, Zellaby admitted, but in principle, I think not nearly so much as would appear at first sight. After all, you would agree that the essential quality of man is the embodiment of a spirit.
Certainly, I nodded.
Well, a spirit is a living force, therefore it is not static. Therefore, it is something which must either evolve or atrophy. Evolution of a spirit assumes the eventual development of a greater spirit. Suppose, then, that this greater spirit, this super-spirit, is attempting to make its appearance on the scene. Where is it to dwell? The ordinary man is not constructed to contain it. The Superman does not exist to house it. Might it not, then, for lack of a suitable single vehicle, inform a group, rather like an encyclopedia grown too large for one volume? I don't know, but if it were so, then two super-spirits residing in two groups is no less probable.
He paused, looking out of the open windows, watching a bumblebee fly from one lavender head to another. Then he added reflectively,
I have wondered about these two groups quite a lot. I have even felt that there ought to be names for these two super-spirits. One would imagine that there were plenty of names to choose from, and yet I find just 2 out of them all persistently invading my mind. Somehow, I keep on thinking of Adam and Eve.
2 or 3 days later, I had a letter telling me that the job I had been angling for in Canada could be mine, if I sailed without delay. I did, leaving Janet to clear things up and follow me. When she arrived, she had little more news of Midwich, except on a rather one-sided feud which had broken out between the Freemans and Zellaby. Zellaby, it appeared, had told Bernard Westcott of his findings. An inquiry for further particulars had reached the Freemans, to whom the whole idea came as a novelty, and one which they instinctively opposed. They at once instituted tests of their own, and were seen to be growing gloomier as they proceeded. "But at least I imagine they'll stop short of Adam and Eve," she added. "Really, old Zellaby." The thing I shall never cease to be thankful for was that we happened to go to London when we did. Just fancy if I'd become the mother of a 31st part of an Adam, or 29th part of an Eve. It's been bad enough as it is, and thank goodness we're out of it. I've had enough of Midwich, and I don't care if I never hear of the place again.
Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe to hear more great stories.